Hey guys, welcome back to another review. If you guys see the infamous green case in the background, you know that we're going to cover the EDgun Matador today. Now this is a gun that's been reviewed before, but I thought we would try something different. Oftentimes on the forums, I see the question come up, should I get a 22 or 25? So I thought today we would do a head-to-head comparison, look at both guns, I'll look at the features, cover some things that I like and some things I don't like and I wish would be improved on the Matador, and then we'll take it to the field and see which one outperforms the other. Looking at the 22 and the 25, they're both exactly the same in length and weight, as well as pretty much all their specifications. They're really the only difference that can be found in these two guns are back here at the breech. One breech and pellet probe is set for a 25 and the other set for a 22. And the regulators are set a little bit differently. The 22 regulator is set at 120 bar, while the 25 regulator is set at 130. Both these guns are pretty much set up from the factory to shoot the JSB, either 18.1 grain in the 22 at approximately 925 to 930 feet per second, and the 25.39 JSB King 25 caliber is set up to shoot the same exact speed, 925 to 930. Both guns have a Lothar-Walther barrel, and as you can see at the front, both of these have been upgraded with Ed's new offset moderator, which just came out a couple months ago. Both guns weigh approximately 6 pounds. They both have a 20 MOA rail, and they both have an ingenious magazine holder that fits underneath the rail. This is one of the complaints that I have is I put the 22 down and grab the 25. As you can see here with the 25 that it will not hold 4 magazines. Ed made this rail with the 22 in mind, not the 25, because the 22 holds 4. So the only thing it'll hold is 3 underneath the rails. It's really an ingenious system of how it works. These two little spring-loaded detents fit underneath the rail and click in, and they hold pretty nicely, so it's nice for hunting. I just wish they would hold 4 magazines in the 25 caliber. Okay, so now that we've covered the specs of the gun, I want to talk about the positive and negative that I think about the Matador. I've had both these guns for a long time, so I've had a lot of experience with them, and there's some things that irritate me about the gun and some things I love about it. That's why I still own it. But as I pull the stock off, one of the major things that kind of irritates me about the gun is the hammer spring tensioner. Look right here, this is the hammer spring tensioner. And as you can see here, one of the little hacks that I have, as you look here, is putting an O-ring behind the locking collar. Now this locking collar, the way this hammer spring tensioner, if you turn it one way, it increases the speed. You back it off the other way, it decreases the speed. But as you're shooting, if you don't put a little O-ring back here, this will back off. So you can spend hours tuning and fine-tuning this hammer spring tensioner to try to get the lowest possible extreme spread. And everything's going great for maybe 3 weeks or a month or maybe even just a few days depending on how much you shoot it. And then this little locking collar comes undone and it starts backing out. Its natural tendency is to want to take the spring tension off the gun. So as the spring tension backs out, then you start losing speed and you notice it where your point of impact changes. And then the first thing you always need to look when you own a Matador is, has my hammer spring tensioner backed off? I really wish that this had a little lock on it, either a thread locker or some other way to lock and keep this from moving. The other thing that's really irritating about this design is that I have to pull the stock off every single time I want to tune it. And I can tell you that it becomes very laborious after a while. The trigger is not exactly what I would call match grade. It has a little bit of creep on it no matter what you do, and there are some hacks to tune it, but none of them really work that great. And the way the trigger pull works is it's not necessarily just the weight, it's just how much creep it has. And because of the swing arm back here, which I'll show you when I take this thing apart, there's a little bit more lock time than there should be. Now lock time is something that we air gunners don't talk about a lot, but it is a very important factor. The quicker the lock time is, the quicker the hammer falls, and the less chance you have to make slight little errors. So having a gun that has an instant lock time is definitely an advantage for shooting. If you can look here, my little washer came off the stock. Tell you, this washer, if you look in here with a hole, you can see this washer goes right there. Now these things come unglued all the time, and if you lose this little washer, what happens is this doesn't have quite enough space as it sits right here underneath the wood stock. If it doesn't have this washer on here, every time you go to cock it, the trigger mechanism will slightly release and you may not get consistent trigger pulls. My other complaint about the gun is the indexing of the magazine. Now, I really think that when Ed did this, he kind of did it as an afterthought. This gun was originally designed as a single shot. And the way it works, I'll take it apart again at the bench and I'll show you more specifically how it works. But there's a little arm that comes and pushes like that each time. And if you don't get an absolute perfect index, what happens is sometimes your magazine will be slightly off. And as your pellet probe goes through the hole, what will happen is it'll shave off part of your pellet as it goes into the breech. When this happens, you'll most definitely get spiraling. So you have to make sure that this is indexing and timed perfectly. And one of the ways you do that is when you insert the magazine, you give it a turn until it locks a little bit. You can hear it go. But if you watch the barrel move, you can see that that one was in time. You can see that one wasn't. So it's all on how you pull it, and you have to give it a really firm yank. And you can see that even with that firm yank, it's still wiggled a little bit. Well, if that wiggle is enough, and that one was perfect. That one wasn't quite perfect. If you see that it wiggles just a little bit on insertion, it will shave that pellet off, or it can shave that pellet off, I will say, and you will most definitely get spiraling if you do that. One of the disadvantages of the JSB is that it's very soft and very prone to pellet deformation. Okay, continuing on with my complaints about the gun. The grip kind of bothers me a little bit. If you look at the grip, the angle is pretty much almost a 90 degree in the front. There's no slope, and it's not really long enough. So when you put your hand in here, you can see that your pinky just kind of wants to fall off. This is really not so much of a problem with the 22, but with a 25, you really need to have good grip control. So what you kind of have to do is climb up to the top of this finger hole to get your pinky on here so that you can get a good grip. And it's just not very comfortable. I would like to see this reshaped. Now, one thing I do like about the stock is this little bar is perfectly angled to grab and walk with it like so. Another thing that's kind of a neat feature, and that when I first looked at the gun kind of turned me off, was this weird little U-shape in the back here. Now, it looks a little strange and kind of, in my opinion, always looked very Russian to me. But what's really cool about it is, as you can see here, it gets you a nice little purchase on the rear bag. And if you wanted to put a monopod in the back here, there's a nice little flat spot where you could do that. And I think that would aid in target shooting, and I found it very handy with a bag. Another great feature about the stock is I think the buttstock is finished very nicely. I really like this little touch of the EDgun in the back, and it's shaped pretty well. And it really kind of holds into your shoulder wall nicely. I like it. And the distance between the bottom of the toe of the buttstock and where your face goes is a good distance. So it's a very comfortable gun to shoot. The other feature that I love about it is that Ed put a 20 MOA rail in here. This is something that I have been kind of on manufacturers every chance I can get, is will you add MOA to your rail, and nobody wants to do it. But Ed understands how crucial it is for long-range shooting, and how on a bullpup, because this sits so much higher than the bore, putting a little bit of MOA or downward cant on the rail itself really aids in long-range shooting. And if you can look at my SWFA here, you can see that I'm just at the number 3, just above the number 3, which is going to give me quite a few spins. And that directly comes as a result of this MOA rail. Another feature that I like is the magazine disconnect. It's very simple and it works extremely well. So if I put a magazine in and the gun is cocked, the system of how most PCPs work, I don't trust safeties. So for me, the best safety in the world is just to leave the pellet in the breech, turn the magazine disconnect off, pull the trigger, and decock the gun. Now it's completely safe. And what I do as one of the features that always tells me that there's a pellet in the breech is I just leave this arm down. And if this arm is down on my gun, I know that there's a pellet in the breech. I cock, shoot, and then turn the magazine indexing back on. Now with the sound meter out, we're going to compare the 22 versus the 25. Sound can be a huge deciding factor on which gun you pick, so we'll go ahead and see which one is louder. First we're going to do 3 shots with the 22. Both of these guns are shooting 930 feet per second. Okay, so now let's do the 25, 3 shots, and take a look what the sound profile is. I'm going to show you what I think is the best sequence to take the gun apart. So first thing what you want to do is start with the breech here. And there's really only 3 sizes of wrenches you need. So you pull these 2 screws, and there's a little notch here in the rear, as you can see, that allows the screw to come up. The best system is to push the bolt in and pull it out. Now the very next thing that I always do is release. Put your finger on the hammer, which is inside down here, and pull the trigger and gently release it so that this doesn't drop while you're pulling the stock off. The next thing I do is pull the stock. This is a 4mm bolt head. And while I got the breech off, I want to show you how the indexing works. You look at this little arm right here. This is your indexer. And one of the things that can go wrong with the indexer is this little barrel here is dirty. If that barrel is dirty, you can see how the last couple inches is what pushes the index. And that's what grabs, this part is what grabs this little cog and turns the barrel of the magazine. This is your disconnect, and merely all it does is lift the cocking arm out of the way and makes it so it still cocks, it just doesn't engage the cog anymore. So if there's a little bit of dirt and it pushes, if there's a little bit of dirt under this cocking arm and it pushes it up a little bit, it will not engage the cog. So you want to make sure that this is free of all lead dust and debris and has a nice little coating of Ballistol on it, and that will help you always have a gun that will index properly. The next sequence I do when I take the gun apart is I pull the trigger mechanism off. Start with the rear. And then the 2 bolts in the front, they're all the same size. Very well thought out. This gun was really thought, I think, by Ed to be designed to be fixed in the field. Now, as you notice, I held the trigger mechanism as I started to turn the last screw, and that's because there's a little bit of spring always in this hammer pushing against it because it kind of has gone all the way forward. So there's your trigger mechanism. The next thing you do to take the gun apart is you can take this apart with the air in the tube. It's very simple. If you pull the rear plug next, then when you separate the upper receiver from the air tube, the transfer port won't get caught on the rear plug. And now, release the breech from the air tube. So those two little screws release the breech, and you just slide it off, and you can see it comes out really easily if you take this little back piece off. And really, when you're maintaining the gun, there's really no reason to detension the barrel unless you're putting a new moderator on. There's a little tiny brass O-ring. I always take that off next because it does seem to find a place to hide every time I tune this gun. There are two ways to degas this gun. You can just take a screwdriver and push down on the valve. This is the valve assembly right here. Or you can contact Ernest Rowe for a degassing tool. The degassing tool works like a charm. It basically screws on to the bottom of the regulator. So you just gently screw it on until it bottoms out. And you can see that it's pressurized. Now, one of the things that I do like to do is I do like to maybe shoot off some of the air so that it's not so violent. And all you do is now turn the wheel slowly. Okay, so now we're going to pull the regulator. You may have a little bit of trouble pulling these off if you haven't done this in a long time or you've never done it. And the reason being is that these are steel screws that sit in aluminum. And I'm going to show you a little trick here as I pull these off. What you need to do before you reassemble the gun, and I'll show you that as I reassemble it. There are 3 sets of screws to hold the regulator together. You can use your puller, gently pull, and there's your regulator. As you can see here, it's marked at 130 bar. Okay, so one of the smart things you can do is this has to go in a certain direction. So what you can do is mark the top of the regulator and the bottom of the regulator so that you don't accidentally put the expansion chamber on the wrong side. So this is basically this expansion chamber, and then here is the regulator itself. One of the things that you can always check for is a bad O-ring here. And oftentimes these Belleville washers need to be cleaned. And they come in pairs. This part of the regulator is called the piston. You want to inspect the metal to make sure it's free of any marks that could be left by the washers. And there are 2 O-rings, one on the top and the bottom, and inspect them to make sure they're intact. And so what I'll do is sometimes clean off the washers from some of the black grease that is on there and recoat those with moly coat. And if you look at the washers, you can see that one side's beveled and one's not, and they go together like a clamshell. Just like that. So I'll go ahead and put these back on off camera so it's not boring. I think you guys get the idea of wiping these down. I'll wipe them down, re-moly coat them, and put the regulator back together. Alright, welcome back. So I went ahead and lubed, greased, and put the washers back together. Stacked them like clamshells, as I said. Replaced the O-rings while I'm in the gun. Now I go ahead and gently put them back and screw this regulator setter on the top. And remember, I smartly marked my regulator. I stole this idea from Ernest Rowe, by the way, so I got to give credit. There's my 2 marks and my single mark. Now I basically put the gun back together in the same way. This is your valve port, and this part's going to go in like so. Now a little trick here is to get some moly coat so you don't bend and tear these O-rings up, is deliberately put just a touch of moly coat around the rings. Go ahead and slide. Now you get to the first little O-ring. I usually just take my fingernail, push it down so it doesn't get pinched, and gently push until it clears. Second O-ring. And now the third O-ring. And now that it's in, I line up my holes. And now my regulator is seated properly. Now I promised to show you guys a trick so that these screws do not get stuck in the aluminum. And I had to use quite a bit of force to get them out. So what you want to do is put a little bit of anti-seize. Now the anti-seize that I use is CRC food grade anti-seize. It's not black like some anti-seize. And you just put a little tiny bit. And this is food grade. It's FDA approved. On the threads, and that way the next time you have to get this undone, you won't be breaking screws or ruining your wrenches trying to bust them free. I can tell you that they will get stuck. So we'll go ahead and do that to every single screw. Now you can put this on every single screw that you put back together. And what I do is just double check that all the screws are seated all the way. They don't have to be torqued, but they do have to be tight. Wipe off any anti-seize you may have. And now you're ready to put the gun back together. The next step, and there's a little trick to this, is putting this little brass ring on. So what I do is I put the brass ring on first, and I seat it with my finger till I hear it click. Once I do that, leave this little back plug off, slide the gun back together, and if you do it honestly with no air in the tube, there's an advantage and a disadvantage. The air tube expands a little tiny bit, and it can be a little bit more difficult to get it down this band. But the advantage is that you've checked and make sure that there's no leaks prior to putting it back together. So I'm going to gamble that I put all the O-rings in correctly. Lock this seat down, and the very next thing I do is put the breech back together. I do this next step here so that I don't lose my brass O-ring. Now it's very important, these threads are very fine. So it's important that you use a tool that gives you the good feel to let you know when you are threading this breech back together so you don't cross-thread it. Now while reattaching the breech to the air tube, it's important that the gun remains vertical in the first screw. One of the mistakes that can be made is letting that brass ring walk while you reattach it. If that happens, you'll see a variance in your extreme spread, and the gun will not shoot consistently. Okay, the next step is to put your little back plug on. Single screw down, double screw up. Okay, so now we're on to the tricky part of putting the trigger back together. as you remembered, I had to put tension on this to keep this from walking backwards. So really the simplest way to put the trigger back together is to cock it. But I can tell you that if you pull this bar right here, you can drop this hammer and bust this bushing. So you need to be very careful putting this back together. And I put the rear of the trigger together first. Next, I attach the two front screws on the trigger assembly. I put a little bit of anti-seize on these screws, as they are very thin and have a tendency to get frozen, and they're very easy to break upon removal. Now the very next step I do is go ahead and release the hammer. Reattaching the bolt assembly is much easier when the gun is sitting on the stock. So we'll go ahead and put this back together. If you remember, on my gun here, my washer was loose. I need to re-glue that back down. And here's an easy way to put the stock deck together if your washer is loose, or if you want to just ensure that it's lined up. Put the screw in, take the back of the eccentric hook, slide it in, put the gun upright, and go ahead and tighten it. And again, like with all things, it just needs to be taut. You don't have to torque it. And now our last step is to recock the gun. You can just do it manually with your finger. Take your breech, slide it in, pull it back until the little cutouts show. Now your gun's back together, tuned and ready to go to the field. Thanks for watching part 1 of Matador 22 versus 25. Stay tuned for part 2.